don't have to strive, I don't have to hide. Your grace is enough, it carries my life. Through every storm you shine so bright. I trade my grind for your holy light. No need to fight, no need to fear. Your love surrounds me, you are near. In every step you make it clear. Your peace is all I need to hear. Grace over grind, I'm choosing peace this time. Grace over grind, your power over mine. I rest in your love, let your will align. Grace over grind, grace over grind.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Grace Over Grind. I am your host, Cantina Vanessa Clark. Thank you for joining me for another conversation about faith, healing, purpose, and becoming. Today I want to talk about something that has been on my heart recently. Not grief, not loss, not even healing. I want to talk about becoming. Specifically, I want to talk about the gap between the woman I thought I would become and the woman God is actually creating. Because if we're honest, most of us create a picture of our future long before we ever arrive there. When we're younger, we imagine how life is going to unfold. We imagine the family, the career, the relationships, the milestones, the victories. We create these beautiful little stories in our minds. And I was no different. I grew up as a pastor's daughter in Shreveport, Louisiana. Church wasn't something we just did on Sundays. Church was a way of life. Ministry was woven into the fabric of who I am. I watched people serve. I watched people pray. I watched people lead. I watched people trust God. And somewhere along the way, I developed ideas about what my own life would look like. I thought I knew the path. I thought I knew the destination. I thought I knew how the story would unfold. Now, I wasn't naive enough to think life would be perfect, but I certainly thought it would be predictable. I thought if I loved God, worked hard, did the right things, and treated people well, life would generally make sense. Can anybody relate to that? You think there's a formula. You think if you check the right boxes, life will follow a certain pattern. And then one day you discover that life doesn't always follow the script you wrote. I became a nurse, a profession I've now spent more than 2 decades serving in. 26 years. Think about that. 26 years of caring for people, showing up, helping others through difficult moments. And when I became a nurse, I thought I knew who I was. I was a caregiver, a helper, a fixer, the person who could step into difficult situations and figure out what needed to happen next. But what life eventually taught me is that there are some things you just cannot fix. There are some situations you cannot organize your way out of. There are some experiences that require faith because there is no roadmap. I became a wife. And like many women, I imagined what marriage would look like. I imagined partnership, building a life together, growing old together, permanence. But life doesn't always follow our expectations. I became a mother. And if there is one role that changed me more than any other, it was motherhood. My children taught me about sacrifice, about love, about responsibility, about purpose, about accountability. And when you're raising children, you spend so much time focused on who they're becoming that you rarely stop to think about who you're becoming. You just keep moving, keep serving, keep sacrificing, keep showing up. And somewhere in all of that, life keeps shaping you. The interesting thing is that if someone had met me years ago and asked me who I thought I would become, I don't think I would have described the woman sitting behind this microphone today. I don't think I would have described an author. I don't think I would have described a conference host. I don't think I would have described someone building a platform called the Kovac Collective. I don't think I would have described someone launching a podcast because those things weren't even on my radar. And that's what fascinates me about God. He sees versions of us long before we see them ourselves. While we're busy creating our plans, God is preparing our purpose. While we're focused on what we think we want, God is developing what he knows we need. Looking back now, I realized something. The woman I thought I would become was based on my plans. The woman God is creating is based on his purpose. And those are not always the same thing. Sometimes God allows us to walk roads we never would have chosen because those roads produce things we never would have developed otherwise. Wisdom, compassion, strength, discernment, faith, character, and perhaps most importantly, dependence upon him. Because if everything had gone according to my plans, I wonder if I would have become the woman I am today. Would I have learned the same lessons? Would I have developed the same faith? Would I have discovered the same purpose? Honestly, I don't know. What I do know is this: the older I get, the less interested I become in who I thought I would be. And the more interested I become in who God is actually creating. Because becoming isn't about arriving. It's about allowing God to continue shaping us. And maybe that's where your story intersects with mine today. Maybe your life doesn't look like what you imagine either. Maybe some things happened that you didn't expect. Maybe some doors closed. Maybe some plans changed. Maybe some dreams evolved. Maybe you're standing in a season that looks completely different from the one you imagined years ago. If so, I want you to know something. Different doesn't mean wrong. Unexpected doesn't mean broken. And a changed path doesn't mean a canceled purpose. Sometimes it simply means God is creating a version of you that you haven't met yet. As I look back over my life, one thing becomes very clear. There is a difference between the woman I plan to become and the woman life forced me to become. And I don't mean that negatively. I mean that honestly. Because life has a very special way of teaching lessons we never volunteered to learn. There are lessons you can only learn through experience. There are things no book can teach you, no sermon can teach you, no conference can teach you. Life has to teach them. And life has taught me a lot. For years, I thought strength meant handling everything. I thought strength meant carrying the weight, pushing through, showing up, keeping it together, not letting people see you struggle. I thought strong women had answers. They didn't need help. They simply figured it out. Then life humbled me. Because eventually you encounter situations that are bigger than your strength, bigger than your experience, bigger than your plans. And suddenly you realize that what you thought was strength was often self-reliance, not faith, self-reliance. There were seasons in my life when everything seemed to be changing at once. Relationships, circumstances, opportunities, direction. And every time life shifted, I found myself having to answer a question. Who am I when the things I depended on change? Who am I when the role changes? Who am I when the title changes? Who am I when the plan changes? When life doesn't cooperate? That's not an easy question because many of us unknowingly build our identity around what we do instead of who we are. I was a nurse. I was a wife. I was a mother. I was a helper. I was a fixer. And while all of those things were true, none of those things were my identity. They were roles. And life has a way of reminding us that roles can change, but identity remains. One of the greatest gifts adversity gave me was clarity. Pain has a way of exposing things. It exposes unhealthy patterns, misplaced priorities. It exposes relationships, fears, and insecurities. And while exposure can be uncomfortable, it can also be incredibly valuable because you can't heal what you're unwilling to acknowledge. You can't grow beyond what you're unwilling to confront. And there were things I had to confront. There were moments when I had to admit that I was exhausted. Moments when I had to admit that I was carrying things God never asked me to carry. Moments when I had to admit that I was trying to save people who weren't trying to save themselves. Moments when I had to admit that I was giving from places that were already empty. And that's a hard realization, especially for women, especially for caregivers, especially for people who spend their lives helping everyone else. Because many of us have become or been conditioned to believe that our value is tied to what we do for others. The more we give, the more valuable we are. The more we sacrifice, the more valuable we are. The more we rescue, the more valuable we are. But life eventually taught me that value and usefulness are not the same thing. And that's an important lesson. Because if your identity is built around being needed, you'll eventually find yourself exhausted trying to earn something God already gave you, your worth. I think one of the biggest transformations in my life happened when I stopped asking, how do I keep everyone happy? And started asking, what is God asking of me? Those are very different questions. One leads to exhaustion, the other leads to alignment. And alignment doesn't always make everyone comfortable. Sometimes alignment requires boundaries. It requires saying no. Alignment requires disappointing people. Sometimes alignment requires walking away from the things that no longer fit the season you're in. And that's difficult when you spent your life trying to hold everything together. But growth requires honesty. There was also a time in my life when I believed that if I worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, prayed specifically enough, and did everything right, I could avoid major setbacks. Life taught me otherwise. Not because God wasn't faithful, but because faithfulness doesn't exempt us from difficulty. Sometimes we confuse favor with ease. We think if God is with us, everything should go smoothly. But that's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture teaches us that God is with us in the storm. Not that storms won't come. And somewhere along the way, my faith matured. I stopped expecting life to be easy and started trusting God to be present. That's a completely different mindset. Because when your faith is rooted in God's presence rather than perfect circumstances, you're not shaken every time life changes. You still hurt, you still grieve, you still struggle, but you don't collapse because your foundation is different. And perhaps that's the woman life forced me to become. A woman who understands that strength is not pretending everything is okay. It is being honest while continuing to trust God. Strength is crying and praying, struggling and showing up, admitting you don't have all the answers and believing God does. Strength is not perfection, it's dependence. Today, when I look back over the years, I realize that many of the things I once viewed as interruptions were actually preparation. The difficult seasons, the unexpected turns, the disappointments, the delays, the lessons, the stretching, the growth, all of it was preparing me for the woman I'm becoming now. Not the woman I used to be, not the woman I thought I would become, the woman God was building all along. And the truth is, I don't think he's finished yet. Still shaping, still teaching, still refining, still revealing. And honestly, that excites me. Because it means my story isn't over, and neither is yours. For a long time, I thought becoming was something that happened after the storm. I thought there would be a moment when life finally settled down, a moment when everything made sense, a moment when all the pieces came together. And then, finally, I would become the person God was calling me to be. But I've learned something. Becoming doesn't happen after the journey. It happens during the journey. While you're figuring things out, while you're healing, while you're learning, while you're taking imperfect steps forward. And when I look at my life today, I realize that's exactly what's happening. I'm becoming. Not because I've arrived, but because I'm still willing to grow. And you know what's interesting? For years, I spent so much of my life helping other people discover who they were as a nurse, as a mentor, as a mother, as a friend, as someone people often come to for encouragement. And somewhere along the way, God began asking me a question. Kentina, who are you becoming? Not what are you doing, not what are you producing, not what you're accomplishing, but who are you becoming? Because those are not the same thing. We live in a world that celebrates accomplishments, but God is interested in transformation. The world asks what you've achieved. God asks who you're becoming. And honestly, that question challenged me because there were seasons when I was so busy serving that I wasn't paying attention to my own growth. So busy helping that I wasn't fully investing in becoming. And God began stretching me, not through tragedy, not through crisis, but through opportunity. And opportunity can be just as uncomfortable as adversity because opportunity requires courage. It requires faith. It requires you to believe that you're capable of more than you've experienced so far. One of the biggest examples of that for me is school. I not only enrolled in college again, I enrolled into the College of Ministry. Think about that. Most people at this stage of life are talking about slowing down, retirement, coasting, maintaining, and here I am starting something new. Some people might look at that and think it's unusual, but I don't. I think it's obedience because I realize something. The woman God is building is still learning, still growing, still expanding, still preparing for what's next. And that's important because growth requires humility. Growth requires admitting that you don't know everything. It requires being willing to become a student again. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. Permission to keep growing. Permission to keep learning. Permission to evolve, to become. Then there's the Kovac Collective. If you've been following my journey, you know how much this platform means to me. But what you may not know is how many times I almost didn't do it. How many times I questioned myself. How many times I wondered if anyone would care. How many times I wondered if my voice even mattered. How many times I thought, maybe somebody else is already doing this. Maybe somebody else is more qualified. Maybe somebody else is better. Maybe I should just stay where I am. Have you ever had those thoughts? Have you ever felt called to something and immediately started listening or listing all the reasons you shouldn't do it? I think many of us do because purpose often feels bigger than our confidence. And that's where faith comes in. Faith isn't believing in yourself. Faith is believing that God can work through you despite your fears. That's what happened with the Kovac Collective. I didn't start because I had unlimited confidence. I started because I felt called. There's a difference. And every resource, every workbook, every devotional, every conference, every article, every piece of content is evidence of becoming. Not perfection, becoming. Then came the conferences. If someone had told the younger version of me that I would one day host conferences and speak into the lives of women through my content, navigating healing, purpose, and alignment, I don't know if I would have believed it. Not because I lacked faith, but because I couldn't see it yet. And that's another lesson I've learned. You don't have to see the entire picture to take the next step. You just have to trust God enough to move. Sometimes we delay our purpose because we're waiting for certainty. But certainty rarely comes first. Obedience comes first. Then clarity follows. And now, here we are. Grace Over Grind. A podcast. Something I've thought about for a long time. Something I've considered for years. Something I talked myself out of more times than I can count. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear it. And maybe that's the real fear. Not failure, visibility, being seen, being heard, being vulnerable. Putting your voice out into the world. Because once you do that, people can respond or not respond. They can support you or ignore you. They can agree or disagree. And that's uncomfortable. But do you know what's even more uncomfortable? Living with the regret of never trying. Living with the question, what if I had done it? What if I had trusted God? What if I had stepped out? And so, I finally did. Episode 1. 10 minutes and 40 seconds. Not perfect, not polished, not revolutionary, but published. And there is something powerful about published. Something powerful about finally doing the thing you've been talking about doing. Because becoming doesn't happen while you're waiting. It happens while you're moving. And that's where I find myself today. Moving, growing, learning, building, trusting. Not because I know exactly what comes next, but because I trust the one who does. And maybe that's what becoming really is. Not arriving, not achieving, not reaching some magical destination where everything is finally complete. Maybe becoming is simply waking up every day and saying, God, I'm available for whatever you're building in me next. And if that's true, then I can honestly say this. The woman God is building now is more confident, more aligned, more intentional, more focused on purpose than appearances, more concerned about obedience than approval, and more committed than ever to becoming everything he created her to be. And the beautiful thing is this. I still haven't met the final version of her. Neither have you. Because God is still writing the story. As I was preparing for this episode, I kept coming back to one question. If God is building a new version of us, what is preventing us from becoming that person? And I think the answer is simpler than we realize. Many of us are trying to become while refusing to release. We're trying to move forward while holding on to old versions of ourselves. Old identities, old fears, old disappointments, old expectations, old stories, and sometimes even old dreams. Because here's the truth. You cannot become who God is calling you to be while insisting on remaining who you used to be. At some point, growth requires release. I know that's not always easy because familiar versions of ourselves feel safe, even when they no longer fit. Think about it. How many people are still introducing themselves by a chapter that ended years ago? How many people are still defining themselves by a mistake, a divorce, a disappointment, a failure, a rejection? How many people are still living from an identity that no longer reflects who they are today? I think one of the greatest gifts God gives us is permission to evolve, grow, become. And yet so many of us resist it. We keep returning to old mindsets because they're familiar. We keep returning to old habits because they're comfortable. We keep returning to old versions of ourselves because they're predictable. But God doesn't call us to comfort. He calls us to transformation. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Notice that transformation begins in the mind. Before your life changes, before your circumstances change, before your opportunities change, your thinking changes. You begin seeing yourself differently. You begin seeing God differently. You begin seeing your future differently, and that changes everything. One of the most powerful shifts I've experienced in my own life happened when I stopped asking, why did this happen to me? And started asking, what can God do through me now? That question changed everything. Because one question focuses on the past, the other focuses on purpose. One focuses on what we lost, the other focuses on what remains. One keeps you looking backward, the other invites you forward. And maybe that's where someone listening today finds themselves. Maybe you've been standing between two versions of yourself. The version you've always known and the version God is trying to introduce you to. The question is, which one are you feeding? Which one are you investing in? Which one are you becoming? Because becoming doesn't happen accidentally. It happens intentionally. It happens through choices, daily choices, small choices, faithful choices. The choice to grow, the choice to learn, the choice to forgive, trust, obey, show up, and take the next step. Even when you don't have the entire map, that's becoming. And if I've learned anything over the last few years, it's this. God is not finished. Not with me and not with you. There are still things he's developing, still things he's healing, still things he's revealing and preparing. And perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is assuming that because life has been difficult, our best days are behind us. I don't believe that. I believe purpose still exists, that growth still exists, that impact still exists, that calling still exists, and I believe becoming still exists. Before we close, I want to leave you with something. You are allowed to outgrow old versions of yourself. Growth often requires release. Your identity is not your history. God is more interested in transformation than comfort, and you are still becoming. I want you to ask yourself, what version of me am I still holding on to that God may be asking me to release? Is it a mindset? Is it a fear? Is it a label, a disappointment, an old identity? And what would happen if I trusted God enough to become someone new? Take that question into your prayer time this week. Take it into your journal. Sit with it. Because your future may depend on your willingness to release what no longer fits. As we close today's episode, I want to remind you of something. You are not who you used to be, and that's okay. In fact, that's the point. Growth changes us. Healing changes us. Faith and life changes us. And if we allow Him, God changes us too. So don't spend all your life or all your energy trying to return to who you were. Thank God for who you were. Learn from who you were. Honor who you were. But don't live there. Keep becoming. Keep growing. Keep trusting. Keep saying yes to the version of you God is still creating. Because your story isn't over. Your purpose isn't over. And God's work in your life isn't over. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Grace Over Grind. I am Cantina Vanessa Clark, and this has been Grace Over Grind. Grace over grind every time.